Welcome to another installment of the Strategic Thinkers series. I'm your host, Paul Taillon. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with retired Navy SEAL Commander Dan O'Shea. Commander O'Shea is a combat veteran with more than 25 years of special operations experience and multiple deployments to combat and conflict areas from the Middle East to Africa. A recognized subject matter expert in counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, kidnapping, and hostage rescue. Commander O'Shea, welcome to the program.
My pleasure and honor to be here, Colonel.
To be clear for our audience, the good commander and I are old friends from way back.
Colonel, it's been, man, almost maybe 17, 18 years. We were both
Correct.
Joint Special Operation University professors. And at the time, I was lecturing on a topic titled Combating Hostage Terrorism. And I remember you and I got in a long back and forth, and you described that you'd written a book on that. And I remember exchanging cards. And of course, in my famous library that you know very well because you've been here, one of my prized possessions is your book on hijacking and hostages, government response to terrorism, J. Paul de B. Taillon. So here you are, sir.
Thank you. Commander O'Shea, you have become a recognized international expert in the emergency management of hostage situations. How did you get involved in this field of endeavor?
So my introduction to the whole hostage terrorism world is, of course, as you stated in my previous bio, I had served in the SEAL team, certainly trained in hostage rescue mission, as all special operations forces are. But my introduction to this world happened in the summer of 2004. I had mobilized back on active duty after 9/11, spent 2 years at U.S. Central Command, and took one more assignment at the end of those 2 years to go to Baghdad with the Joint Interagency Coordination Group, or the JIATF, if you will, JIASIC. And it was to work coordination between law enforcement represented by the FBI, who I flew into Baghdad with, including members of the hostage rescue team, the CIA and the intelligence community, and then the State Department. So my job was literally to be a liaison between all components of U.S. national power and the coalition. And on the first day in Baghdad in July of 2004, I went to a morning meeting with the Pull Mill ambassador at the U.S. Embassy and was handed a kidnapping case to deal with. If you go back in time, and that was in July of 2004, but April of 2004 is when the hostage crisis in Iraq rose to the level. And to put it in context, it was when Nick Berg, a American contractor, Jewish American contractor, had been kidnapped by Al Qaeda, and ultimately his execution and beheading was aired live on Al Jazeera, that aired around the world. It was actually done by Zarqawi himself as to send that message. And in April of 2004, there were a total of 94 reported hostage-taking incidents that destabilized everything. And I got there about a month and a half later when the embassy was trying to deal with this crisis. It had now become a playbook for the insurgency to counter the coalition message of trying to move forward and restore democracy and build stability in Iraq. So my first day on the job, I was literally handed a kidnapping case involving two Bulgarians, and they were truck drivers trying to deliver vehicles in Mosul, and they've been captured by Al Qaeda, Zarqawi's group, and Zarqawi had put out a message on the internet that they were going to behead these two Bulgarians unless the Bulgarians pulled their troops out of Iraq. So Bulgaria had a 500-man battalion in Iraq. They're a part of what was called the Coalition of the Willing, put together by President Bush. And the embassy had received a call that morning. The U.S. ambassador received a call from the president himself saying, you know, the Bulgarians are a valued member of the coalition. We'll do everything we can to save the lives of these hostages. The U.S. mission needed to do everything to try and effect this rescue. And it was, you know, handed to me, the one military guy in the room, by the chief of staff, that literally said to me, Dan, you're Navy SEAL, go call your friends. And that's how I ended up getting in the hostage game. And what was supposed to only be summer in Baghdad ended up becoming the next 2 years of my life, standing up an organization called the Hostage Working Group and serving as the coordinator for 22 months, where we dealt with 448 international kidnapping incidents over 2004 to 2006. And largely, as you stated, when I got there, we were dealing with 30, 40, almost 50 kidnappings a month of internationals. It got down into the single digits in the last 2 months of my tour. And so we dealt with this crisis, we addressed it, and ultimately we found a light at the end of the tunnel. But then within the the cat was out of the bag, if you will, because the Taliban started getting in the kidnapping game. The pirates off the coast of Somalia, and then of course ISIS used the hostage terrorism game to their effect very successfully. And now we have Hamas, the latest incident. So all it's done is spread this notion of hostage terrorism around the world because it's a very effective tactic. And that's how terrorism groups and terrorist organizations and rogue regimes, it's how they negotiate with the West, is doing things like kidnappings that we're dealing with today on the world stage with what happened in Israel on October 7th.
Over 50 years ago, the world was gripped by the September 5th, 1972 Munich Olympics, where 8 Palestinian terrorists gained entry into the Munich Olympic Village and cruelly murdered 2 hostages before demanding the release of the Palestinian comrades that were imprisoned in Israel. As you know, 9 other athletes were killed, along with a German police officer in a disorganized rescue attempt. What have we learned about hostage management from this debacle?
That 1972 hostage incident at the Olympics, Munich Games, basically was the wake-up call to this form of hostage terrorism. Hostage terrorism and kidnapping has been around for centuries. It's and in particular with these Middle Eastern groups, it's part and parcel because, as I've always said, people think the oldest profession in the world is prostitution. In reality, in the Middle East, it is kidnapping. It goes back centuries, and it's just part and parcel out of the culture. And the Munich Games put hostage terrorism on the world stage. There's no more viewed event on the planet than the Olympics, so no better stage. And we know that terrorism is fueled by media coverage. And so if you can go at the largest event possible, i.e. the Olympics, that's where you're going to get your message out to the world. And again, what we're seeing on display today with Hamas, it's the same thing. And now they're getting, worldwide support. And that's why they did this attack. That's why they filmed it. And that's why they showed everyone. But what they learned specifically out of Munich is that most countries, even a NATO power like Germany, they were not prepared for this. And the rescue operation, as I know, Colonel, you've studied with your special operations background and talked about it with many of your peers, it proved that the Germans were unable to handle the situation, not only in their leadership, but in their special operations community. And it really sent a message that you need to have an elite tier 1 national mission force that's at the highest levels of capability. And frankly, even today in the modern era, there's only a handful of countries that have a counterterrorism force that can effectively address a hostage crisis, which was on display in Munich. Those forces are not built overnight. They take years and years of training and the best equipment possible to pull these type of missions off. And there's only a select few nations around the world that can actually do this. And Munich was the start of the global experience with a thing called hostage terrorism.
More recently, states like Iran, Russia, and China, amongst others, have taken to the tactic of hybridizing hostage-taking for malign purposes in what has been described as hostage diplomacy. In 2020, the then President Trump signed the Levinson Act to redouble America's government's focus on wrongful detainees. More recently, President Biden issued an executive order focusing on the prevention of the seizure of Americans abroad. Has hostage-taking become an element of adversarial politics within the global order?
Absolutely. And it's not just terrorist organizations like Hamas or ISIS or Al-Qaeda that are in the kidnapping game. Rogue states, as you mentioned, North Korea, Russia. We just had, international incident where Russia is they grabbed an American female WNBA basketball player. They've grabbed a Wall Street Journal reporter on trumped up charges, but they're getting concessions. North Korea got concessions from the U.S. When Lisa Ling's sister, she was a journalist, her sister was over trying to cover a story, and she ended up getting grabbed, and they ended up getting a picture with a former president, U.S. president, as concessions. And so it's not just terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah that are in the kidnapping game. Rogue nation states are involved because the bottom line is hostage terrorism works, and it puts the ball in the court of the bad guys, of the rogue states, the terrorist nation states, and terrorist organizations. And it's ultimately how terrorist organizations negotiate with the West.
In your experience, what are the suggestions that you would make if one of your friends was to be taken hostage?
Well, the biggest thing is do your due diligence before you travel. I mean, people need to be aware of what's going on in the world. There are certain places that are not safe for anyone, much less Americans. You're much more at risk today traveling around the world with a Western passport or looking if you can't blend in with the locals, which is very hard to do if you're traveling overseas beyond Europe for Canadians and Americans. If you come from Northern European stock like you and me, I'm Irish, obviously. You've got a British line and Canadian line, and it's a lot harder for us to blend in. Now, I say this to my Canadian counterparts: when you travel, be very careful where you travel. Don't advertise it. Don't post things on social media. And frankly, you'll laugh at this, Paul, as a Canadian. But when I was at the height of traveling quite a bit to Europe in between trips to the Middle East, and if I stayed in, say, London or Rome or Paris or anywhere, if I got into a taxi, I would never admit where I'm from. And the taxi driver may ask me, well, where are you from? And I can't deny that I'm obviously from North America, but I would never say American. I would actually say I'm a Canadian. And why I would say Canadian, honestly, Paul, is one, people don't hate Canadians. I think you guys are pretty well liked all around the world. Same cannot be said for the ugly American. So you have to be very careful when you travel, and God forbid if you end up in a hostage situation, you need to be prepared for the long haul, because there are criminal groups, there are terrorist organizations, there are nation states that will look at you as simply a pawn, and they're either coming after money or concessions or a combination of the two, and you just become a pawn in this game. And there are plenty of historical examples of Americans that end up detained overseas because they chose the wrong time or the wrong place to visit, not heeding State Department warnings and travel advisories, which are out there. And people, kidnapping is very effective. It's effective at raising money for terrorist organizations, criminal organizations, and it's a hostage represented by the passport can get concessions for rogue states. So people need to be very careful and do their due diligence before they travel, and take all security precautions necessary to try and prevent that. Because once you're captured, the odds of you coming home are, in many cases, slim to none. To be perfectly frank, especially if you're you're traveling to a region that is not frequented by or has a U.S. presence and or military presence where they can launch a rescue mission for you. So do your due diligence before you travel, and make sure you don't travel unnecessarily to conflict or risk zones, and certainly not war zones.
As you know, should conditions demand, a hostage rescue operation conducted by police or military units is always a possibility. Should that rescue occur, what should a hostage do in a rescue situation to enhance their personal survivability?
Well, the most important thing a hostage can do during a hostage rescue mission is stay down. Cover yourself, get in a corner, try and get underneath a bed, a chair, anything, because the first few seconds of the hostage rescue mission, when the special forces or SWAT team is coming in the room, they don't know who's the good guys or the bad guys. And their number one mission is to eliminate the threat. Anyone they see as a threat, someone standing up, someone pointing at them, even having anything in their hand or whatnot, the key is staying down and taking whatever orders are given, follow those orders. But crawl up in a ball and try and wait till the gunfire or the movement stops. And then when someone reaches out and asks, they will have had your bio. They'll know your name. They'll have their picture imprinted on their brain. They'll know who they're looking for. And when they call out your name, and then and only then you respond. But in the initial stages of a hostage rescue, it's most critical that you basically protect yourself, get down, try and cover yourself, get yourself behind cover and concealment, and wait till the shooting stops before you make any movement. And whenever, even in the hours and minutes after, follow the order specifically. Don't rush up, don't run to the door, and follow the orders from those that have come in to save you, because they have to treat everyone as a suspect. You may even be handcuffed and secured, because they need to determine, who's who they're going for. And in the initial stages of that confusion, everyone is a potential threat. So the number one thing you need to do is just get your head down and stay low until the bullets have stopped flying.
Since October 7th, 2023, we have witnessed a myriad of problems confronting the Israeli government. as it relates to the citizens that were taken by Palestinian-based Hamas terrorists. As of today, media reports note still a substantial number of Israelis continue to be held. What are the factors that the Israeli government must consider regarding their hostages as they press their ground offensive?
The hostages were taken specifically for that, to put the only card that Hamas has been able to play since October 7th with the hostages. Had they just gone in and killed the 1,200 Israelis, they would have been wiped out. There would have been no reason. The only thing that is every planning mission for the IDF, for the Air Force, for their troops, for their infantry, every mission has to be in the context of, if we put a bomb in this building, is there a potential of hostages being there? And that is why 250 were taken. In fact, they took hostages from over 40 nations around the world. They took a 10-year-old infant, upwards of 85-year-old men. They took grandparents, grandmothers, and grandfathers. They grabbed anyone at will. And it showed the barbarism, but it shows to the level that they would go. And the irony of ironies is that they're not the ones that have been taken back. They're the ones on the defensive have been the IDF that have gone in to try and wipe out the Hamas threat. And in doing so, there's been a lot of civilians killed in the process. But in reality, when a terrorist organization operates out of mosques and out of hospitals and out of schools and builds tunnels and builds command centers under these hospitals, knowing that they're not going to be, have a direct hit by the IDF or the Israeli Air Force, that's why it's done intentionally. And the sad part is Hamas wants civilian casualties. That's exactly what they're trying to turn public favor in their, public opinion in their favor. And they've been largely effective at doing that. This most recent hostage rescue last weekend, where 4 Israelis were rescued on a very daring, dramatic daylight raid by Israeli special forces. And the details are still coming in. But as they were being pulled out, the entire neighborhood, this quote civilian neighborhood, erupted and started firing on the rescue forces and trying to kill the hostages as they're trying to get them safely to the helicopter. And then, of course, the Israeli Air Force and others responded in helicopters. And there was a large number of, quote, civilian casualties. But how can you call them civilians when they're literally firing upon the rescue force that are trying to save Israeli citizens? So, but again, it's always a propaganda battle. It's always a propaganda war. And you have the UN making a most recent support for a ceasefire, demanding on both sides concessions. But you have a terrorist nation state that's never been an honest broker in any of this. And there's been multiple ceasefire attempts that from on both sides that have gone nowhere since the initial ceasefire that was agreed upon about 100 days into the conflict. They got roughly 100 of the hostages out, but there was roughly 120, 130 hostages left behind. The presumption is that a lot of them, if not most, have been killed. We don't know the numbers exactly. We don't know how many are still alive, but Netanyahu and the IDF have been very clear up front that we're going to wipe out Hamas and we're going to rescue our hostages. And proof was in what was accomplished last weekend in Gaza.
Oh, quite an impressive operation.
Without a doubt. I mean, this will go down in the annals of the raid on Entebbe for the IDF. Literally in a daylight raid, the special forces went under cover of a U-Haul truck dressed as Gazans, if you will, and they can blend in. What people don't realize is how diverse. I think the IDF might be one of the most diverse militaries in terms of ethnicities in the ranks. There are plenty of Arab Israelis that can blend in. They spoke the dialect. They were able to literally drive through checkpoints in Gaza into a area where there are not Israeli defense forces. There weren't the Israeli army in the area. It was literally in a region that they had already gone through, but they found intelligence that led them to the 4 hostages being held by civilians, no less. One of whom was an Al Jazeera journalist and Hamas ministry spokesman who was a Gazan journalist who was holding 3 of the 4 hostages in his house. So when they keep making this notion that there's all these innocent civilians in Gaza, it's kind of hard to be innocent when you are holding hostages and or you're firing upon rescue forces who are trying to save their own national citizens. So you need to take it, this whole notion that Gazans are innocent when in many cases they are very complicit into what Hamas did on the 7th and what is continuing happening in Gaza today.
Considering the attack on Israel in October and reflecting what has happened since that time period, particularly the ground offensive against Hamas in Gaza, what do you think politically this will have on Israel in the wake of the operation?
Well, Israel has, again, with the current leadership, Netanyahu, the hardliners, the conservative hardliners, they have not been deterred. They've been under pressure from almost day one. In fact, the narrative turned against Israel within hours of the October 7th attack. I mean, there are deniers. You can look at protests outside of the White House over the weekend. We're literally denying that people were being held hostage. We're denying that Israeli women had been raped on October 7th, that grandparents and children had been murdered in their own beds. You have advocates in capitals around the West, from Europe to Canada to America, that are protesting the quote, the death toll, the civilian death toll in Gaza. And it for someone who, if you got to put it in context, what October 7th represents to Israel is not what 9/11 represented to America. And no one after 9/11 in the international community made the argument to the U.S. that we did not have the right to go after al-Qaeda and ultimately bring Osama bin Laden to justice. No one ever seriously pushed back. There was no UN resolution that the U.S., even going into Iraq, which had, as we know now, had nothing to do with 9/11. And those conflicts lasted 20 years, and no one on the international community came after the U.S. like Israel within days of the October 7th assault into Israel by Hamas itself. So it's just a different calculus. The hypocrisy is glaring on so many levels. The level of anti-Semitism we're seeing around the world is staggering. But I just think Israel has to stay the course. They understand, that Netanyahu's position is we'll never let another 9/11 or October 7th in their case happen again. And they need to finish this. And it's the same context that the U.S. military mindset had after the attacks on 9/11, that we were going to wipe out al-Qaeda and hunt bin Laden down, and we did.
It strikes me as this is probably one of the finest psychological operations that any terrorist organization has orchestrated. What's your take?
You nailed it. That is 100% on spot. That here it is. They murdered 1,250 people over a 6-7 hour period, crossing the border into Israel. Israel was on the verge of signing historic treaties with Saudi and other Gulf nations. And that's exactly why this was done. That's why the elephant in the room is Iran. Iran is funding this. This is proxy war by the mullahs in Tehran with their proxy fighters in Hamas and Hezbollah. And that's why rockets, we haven't even brought it up today, there are rockets every day coming from Lebanon fired by Hezbollah into Israel. And roughly 60,000 Israelis have been displaced. So Israel is on a wartime footing, but unlike America, where only the 1% of us actually went to war, everyone in Israel is affected by this. There's not a person in Israel that does not know someone or had a friend or some connection directly to the 1,250 that were killed on October 7th. That's why this is much more personal. The contacts I have, and I'm hearing from in Zoom chats on Signal from Israel itself, is that the average Israeli knows that they're in a fight for their existence. And that's why they must finish Hamas and deal with Hezbollah probably next. So they're in this for the long haul because they realize the stakes. They're under tremendous pressure by the world because, as you said, Hamas has been extraordinarily effective in turning the narrative against, they're the attackers, right? Hours after the rescue mission, they're putting out 294 civilians were killed. Well, why were those civilians holding hostages? Why were those civilians firing on the rescue force that was trying to rescue Israeli citizens that have been held hostage for the last 8 months? And it's always the narrative. And sadly, mainstream media always takes the narrative. I mean, our own vice president was mentioning over the weekend about all the innocents killed during the rescue mission. And it's like, in my humble opinion, if you're guarding and harboring terrorists and or doing their bidding by holding hostages and or firing upon Israelis trying to rescue their own, you're not an innocent civilian. you're a terrorist.
You coined the phrase a while back called hostage terrorism. Could you please define that?
Absolutely. I wrote this definition on hostage terrorism after my 2-year tour, and I've done a lot of research on this. I've got a couple of your books on kidnappings in my own personal library, and as you know, I've got 2 or 3 shelves filled with hostage books. This is something near and dear, and I came up with this definition almost 2 decades ago, and it's never more relevant than today. Hostage terrorism are terrorist groups who use the criminal act of abducting and holding individuals against their will to announce their agenda, raise their profile, negatively influence, disrupt, and degrade the political will and decision-making ability of their declared adversary. Their hostages are used for the purpose of making public demands, raising awareness to their cause and/or funds by extorting ransoms and/or forcing concessions from nation states or other entities.
Interesting. On that note, I'd like to thank you, Commander, for your time, your service, and your diligence in the fight against hostage terrorism. We greatly appreciate it, and we look forward to having you in future Policy Insights Forum's The Strategic Leaders Series. Thank you again, Commander.
Thank you. I'd be honored to join, and I appreciate your time, Colonel. Always a very insightful discussion with you.
Take care. Cheers.
Cheers.